The latest on a 747 that veered off on a runway in Hong Kong, killing 2 in a vehicle on a service road. The NTSB released their prelim report on the Brett James Cirrus Crash. A captain ignores 2 go-around callouts from the first officer and ends up overrunning the runway. And the cause of famed adventurer Felix Baumgartner's fatal paragliding crash is revealed. Finally, is it man or machine that brought down Air India 171? Seems there are some very opinionated people on both sides of this one. We'll take a look at the facts up to this point on Taking Off. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken. Lots of stories to cover, including a lot of controversy over the Air India 171 crash. Let's start with the 747 cargo plane in Hong Kong. Emirates Airlines leased a cargo 747 from ACT, a Turkish company, to help fill the void from delays on Boeing orders for the airline. Boeing stopped making the 747, the last one rolling off the line December of 2022, instead offering the newer 777 freighters. But rising demand and delays have led some airlines, like Emirates, to find stopgap solutions. On Monday, October 20th, just before 4 a.m., the 747 crashed after landing at the Hong Kong International Airport. Looking at the route and the ADSB data, there was nothing unusual in the approach for this Turkish crew of 4 on board. They originated from Dubai, and weather was good at Hong Kong, and the runway was dry and in good shape. ATC cleared the 747 for a high-speed approach, and for non-pilots, this high-speed approach is very common. In certain airspace, there are speed restrictions. For instance, in the U.S. around major airports, the max speed might be 250 knots. And some of these larger planes need to go faster than that due to weight or other considerations. And they will be allowed to exceed the airspace speed limit so that they don't drop down too slow for that aircraft. Their speeds coming into land were normal. There was nothing indicative of the upcoming problem. They landed right at the touchdown markers on centerline. During the rollout, the large airplane veered to the left, departed the runway, and crossed over infield before going over a service road where sadly a vehicle was with 2 occupants. The 747 ran over the vehicle, killing both people inside, and the 747 continued into the water, turning about 180 degrees in the process. At time of impact with water, the speed was reported as 49 knots on ADSB. The 4 crew people on board the 747 were rescued, and the morning light revealed dramatic images of the stricken airplane. Leading the investigation is the Air Accident Investigation Authority, or AAIA, Hong Kong's Agency for Air Crash Investigations. The United States NTSB has sent a team of 5 investigators to Hong Kong to assist them, and I'm sure Boeing will send help as well. Investigators will look at braking, tires, human elements to determine what went wrong on that landing rollout. Okay. Country songwriter Brett James's crash prelim report and controversy on Air India is coming up. But first, the prelim report on another landing problem, a bit smaller than the 747, this time in the U.S. at Roanoke, Virginia. The NTSB released their preliminary report on a United Express Embraer ERJ 145 that was landing on Wednesday, September 24th, 2025 at the Roanoke Blacksburg Regional Airport. The airplane overran the end of runway 34 and came to rest in the EMOS arresting area. That's the soft pavement at the end of runways that is made for such event, like a runaway truck ramp in the mountains. There were thankfully no injuries to the 3 crew and 50 passengers, and amazingly, no damage to the plane. The captain was the pilot flying, and the first officer was the pilot monitoring. Before departing Washington Dulles, the plane had to be deplaned twice for maintenance-related anomalies. But the third time's a charm, and they boarded and pushed back about 2.5 hours late. En route, The pilots reviewed the weather for Roanoke. It reported calm winds, no precipitation, and that runway 6 was in use. The first officer recommended reviewing the chart for landing on a wet runway, but the captain declined since they were reporting no precipitation. During the descent to the airport, approach control informed them of precip along the approach path to runway 6 and that other aircraft were now using runway 34. The captain changed for the ILS approach to 34, and on final approach in heavy rain, the captain asked the first officer to run the performance calculations for landing on a wet runway. The first officer determined they had a margin of 200 feet more than was required without thrust reversers, and that's a narrow margin for those keeping score at home. The captain briefed the go-round procedure, and on short final, the rain intensity increased. Windshield wipers were at full, and as they descended below 500 feet, the first officer saw they were high above the PAPI lights, and he observed the captain correcting. But when they got over the threshold, they were still high, and the first officer called for the go-around, but the captain continued the landing. Now, a word about crew resource management. Talking to my airline pilot friends, it is unusual for the captain to ignore the first officer's go-around. Yes, the captain is the one who decides, so it's not like he had to go around. But general best practices is if someone calls go around, you go around, and you sort out the why later. Maybe the pilot monitoring sees a truck on the runway, or whatever reason, it's unusual for the captain to ignore the go-around call-out, especially with landing margins so narrow. Then further down the runway, the first officer again called for the go-around, and again the captain continued. The captain touched down and they applied maximum braking and deployed the thrust reversers. It wasn't enough, they overran the runway. After coming to a complete stop, they ran the emergency evacuation checklist, and airport rescue and firefighting personnel boarded the plane. Again, thankfully, no injuries. NTSB has not issued a final report. And what I can take away from this is a reminder, no matter what level of pilot I am, to not let get their itis impact my decision making. Again, not saying that that's what happened here, but I can certainly use this to remind myself about get their itis. All right, new report out on famed Austrian adventurer Felix Baumgartner's death in a paragliding accident in July. And we're going to talk to a trainer and a friend of Felix. This and Brett James Prelim and the controversy on Air India 171 after a word from our new sponsor. Hey guys, I used to shave with one of the mainstream cartridge companies, but I hated spending all that money on very expensive refills. Now, back when the clubs started interrupting the shaving industry, I jumped all over that. And I did it for a couple of years with that monthly cost. I rolled back my membership to every other month, skipping shaving when possible to save cartridges from wearing out so quickly. I stashed disposables at the studio here and even in my car. I went ahead and tried a different club, and it was even worse. Finally, a third club, and that was strike 3. I was out. And I reluctantly went back to one of the major industry manufacturers and shelled out the money for replacement cartridges. I needed a solution to expensive, mediocre shaves. Then Henson reached out to me. Henson Shaving. You see, I had been downgrading and in the long run spending a lot of money. With Henson, I upgraded to a more engineered, precision, skin-friendly shave, and the blade refills are pennies, not bucks like everything else. Like 10 cents, for real. Upgraded, and spend less in the long haul. After years of frustration, problem solved. The Henson AL13 in blue, for me, is my forever solution. I'm grateful for finding Henson, and you can too. I've got a QR code on the screen, and you can use my code TakingOff for 100 free blades, and that's a couple of years of blades. A couple of years for not having to pay for expensive refills, club memberships, and all that. Hoo-ha. Scan the QR or click on the link below. Use code TakingOff for 100 free blades. Henson Shaving. Felix Baumgartner, the first skydiver to fall faster than the speed of sound when he made the free fall jump from space in 2012, died when the paraglider he was flying crashed near a hotel swimming pool in July in Italy. He was 56. Witnesses claimed the glider started spinning, and several reports suggested mechanical failure. But the investigation has concluded that there were no mechanical or technical issues. The authorities stated he fell into a spiral and he could not get out of it. He was unable to do the maneuver that he should have done to exit. Baumgartner was a former military parachutist and was a meticulous planner of these events. And I reached out to one of his friends to talk about who Felix was and what we can take away. Scott Urschel is an aerobatic helicopter pilot among many other certifications. Here's Scott.
I met Felix in 2016 when he came to Arizona to a helicopter training camp for Red Bull. And we became friends. And Felix was a new helicopter pilot at that time. And my friend Blackie Schwartz was the chief pilot for Red Bull Red Bull at the time. And a year or so later, he had called me and asked if I would talk to Felix and have Felix come over. He wanted to try and obtain his statement of aerobatic competency in a helicopter. I questioned Blackie at the time of, boy, how much time does Felix have? And he says, I think at the time he had 600 or 800 hours of helicopter time. And I said, do you really think that's a good idea? And he said, I'd like you to meet him and spend some time with him and just see what you think. And Felix came to my house and walked in, and he had about a quarter of a ream of white paper that he had drawn all of the helicopter aerodynamics with colored Sharpies. He was a fantastic artist. And not only did he draw just everything that applied to helicopters, but how aerobatics applied and some of the unique handling characteristics of the BO-105. And I was so impressed that I asked him if I could keep them, and then I scanned them. And every now and then I break them out, and I just marvel at how focused he was. He was really risk adverse. He didn't get where he got and survived, jumping from space and base jumping off buildings. He was super focused. He would ask you a question and you would answer it, and he would ask you another question. He was never satisfied with his knowledge base. It's just such a tragedy to see what happened to Felix. But I think the takeaway for all of us is that it doesn't require you to do something that's extreme to be in a position where something can happen. An accident can happen anytime. I mean, we've seen it in the air show industry. It doesn't matter how experienced you are, how good you are. You can be put in a situation that's unrecoverable. Motor paragliding, I guess by comparison to doing low-level aerobatics, is quite safe. Obviously something happened, and we may never know what happened. As we know, as you report on a lot of these accidents, I mean, even after the NTSB gives a final report, we don't know what happened. But I think the takeaway is that none of us are in a position where we're not immune from being killed in a flying machine. And it doesn't matter how good you are, how proficient you are, and how well you've been trained. We're all susceptible.
Yeah, physics doesn't care if you're a newbie, intermediate, or if you're the best pilot in the world. Physics don't care.
No, but my takeaway from this is, I used to think, you had to have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 hours. That used to be the norm for helicopter pilots or airplane pilots. An ATP has to have 1,500 hours, and so we've put an hour relationship with performance. And an average F-16 fighter pilot has less than 200 hours because he has been immersed in professional training. After flying with Felix and working with him and getting to know him, I have a completely different outlook, and I use him as my example when I speak at different events. That if you're properly trained, you're focused, you're disciplined, and most importantly, you have to respect these machines. There's not one of them out there that won't kill you. And we haven't figured out a different way to kill ourselves in airplanes and helicopters. Nothing's changed. It's the same scenario all the time. People see Felix and his posts and everything, and he's this extreme athlete, but he was risk adverse without question. And so it's a tragedy, but it happens.
All right, before the Air India controversy, the Brett James Cirrus Crash. On September 18th, 2025, at 2:56 p.m. near Franklin, North Carolina, a Cirrus SR-22T crashed on an aborted landing attempt, and the NTSB has released their preliminary report. Brett James was a well-known and well-liked singer-songwriter, having written for Carrie Underwood, including Jesus Take the Wheel, and Kenny Chesney, Jason Aldean, and many others. He was the pilot, and his wife and adult stepdaughter were on board as well, and all three perished. The airplane was on an Instrument Flight Rules flight plan from Nashville's John C. Toone Airport, destined for Macon County in Franklin, North Carolina. The weather was good. James was high on approach and had to get down. He requested the visual approach to runway 7, as he had the airport in sight, and he was approved. He was cleared to contact the Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, or CTAF, for Macon County, and moments later radioed that he was at 6,800 feet and intended to perform a 360 to descend to runway 7. ATC advised him that he was still on with center, and that's a common mistake. I've made it a bunch. You press the frequency transfer button and it doesn't take, or you accidentally double punch, or you forget. It happens. So presumably, he switched to CTAF and repeated the call. Review of the ADSB data shows that he approached the runway at about 1,300 feet above the ground. He was still high, and the report mentions video surveillance that caught the airplane flying over the runway before initiating a descending left turn before entering a spiral and impacting the ground. Now, when we did our initial report on this, I had someone comment who lives out there and has flown that. There are some pretty big hills surrounding the airport, and you do have to come in kind of high and get down. It's a bit of a tricky deal. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the plane rocking side to side before rolling inverted and descending behind a tree line that was near the elementary school's playground just off the runway. Initial examination does not reveal any mechanical or engine failure at this point. While the Cirrus does have an airframe parachute, that low to the ground, if something happens, there's just not enough time to deploy it. Investigators will look closer to rule out the mechanical or engine potential failure, and they'll look at the maneuvering. When you turn or bank, it will raise the stall speed at which the aircraft will stall. They'll look at the speed for the go-around. This is a tragic accident. Our condolences to the family that's left behind. We'll know more when the final report comes out in about a year. Turning to Air India Flight 171, the Boeing 787 that crashed June 12, 2025 in Ahmedabad. The most recent news has been a push for transparency from the families of the victims, specifically the captain's father filing a lawsuit. There are two camps to this horrible crash that took 260 lives. Those that believe it was Boeing's fault and those that believe it was pilot caused. And in my reporting on this channel, both sides have been extremely vocal in the comments section. Look, I don't have a dog in this fight. I have no love for the Boeing Corporation or a love for those pilots. I have no preconditioned agenda that I look for evidence to support. Instead, no bias, and let the facts land where they will so that we can take what we learn to be safer. And here are some facts that we do know at this point. First, the airplane came down just after takeoff when both engines lost thrust. The Aircraft Accidents Investigation Board, or AAIB, the Indian equivalent of the U.S. NTSB, released some info in a preliminary report mentioning cockpit voice recorder transcripts of one pilot asking, "Why did you cut off?" and the other replying, "I didn't." The actual recordings were not released, and the vagueness and the selectivity has greatly contributed to a mistrust by the global public on the information. The captain was Sumit Sabharwal, and the first officer was Clive Kundar. Kundar was the pilot flying, and the captain was pilot monitoring. Some reports have the first officer asking why the cutoff. This release of information puts the spotlight on the pilots, whether an accidental fuel cutoff to the engines or purposeful cutoff of the fuel to the engines. The two switches have a lock on them so that they can't be accidentally knocked off. You have to pull up on the switch to move it to position. And according to the AAIB, there was a distinct sound 1 second apart of both engine fuel cutoffs being cycled. But the captain's 88-year-old father has filed a lawsuit contending that the investigation is profoundly flawed. His petition says that factual misdirection through selective disclosure, especially against crew who cannot defend themselves, impedes root cause discovery and threatens future flight safety, calling for a neutral judicial lens. Sounds more like a lawyer than an 88-year-old, but we'll go with that. They go on to complain that the AAIB 5-member board is dominated by DGCA officers. The DGAC is equivalent to the US FAA, whose procedures and oversight is implicated in the investigation. In other words, the DGCA has a dog in the hunt to point to the crew instead of their policies or procedures. And of course, the captain's dad has a dog in the hunt that he doesn't want the problem to be with his son. Boeing would want it to be the crew so that it's not their plane's fault. And I do agree, there needs to be unbiased investigation here. But the biased claims need to be applied to both sides. The father is not unbiased. DGCA is not unbiased. Boeing is not unbiased. And I don't know what the answer here is other than the AAIB needs to be extremely transparent. And so far, based on their prelim report, they really haven't been. The lack of transparency will only feed the fire for those biased to either side. And by the way, for those who point to mechanical reason that the fuel was shut off, like the Boeing computer or whatever, basing your opinion on the fact that the pilot said, "I didn't," I agree the evidence shows the pilot said, "I didn't," but it doesn't mean he didn't. Just because he said that doesn't mean he did that. And just because a person says something doesn't make the action true. I know, shocker. But I would rather see the data to back all that up. Trust, but verify. All this needs verification. So now the lawsuits and petitions begin to work their way through India's legal system. And we'll see what happens there. And hopefully we can get an accurate, transparent facts, data, and evidence as to what happened. We owe it to the victims, and we owe it to the safety of the aviation industry. If it was the pilots, then it's the pilots. If it was the plane, then it's the plane. Let's make it safe. That's my take on Air India Flight 171. And that wraps up our report today. Lots of news. Please support us by supporting our sponsors, like our new one with Henson Shaving. It really helps us if you click on those links and buy. Also, like flyingeyesoptics.com/takingoff10, where you'll get 10% off your Flying Eyes glasses. They're the best glasses under headsets and helmets. Look how thin they are. They slide right in there. Thanks for watching, and please check out this recent report right here. By the way, thanks Cam for all the links. And remember, superior judgment trumps superior skill. Take care and stay safe out there.